My name is Alara, and the last thing I remembered was the cold. A cold that seeped from the linoleum floor of the hospital corridor into my bones. A cold that was nothing compared to the glacial void where my daughter's heartbeat used to be. I had clutched her small, still body, my tears freezing on my cheeks as the life I knew drained away into silence. The money for her surgery was gone, taken by the man who had vowed to cherish us, given to another woman for her ambitions. I died of a broken heart. I'm sure of it. But then I opened my eyes. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the familiar flimsy curtains of my home. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke filled my lungs. I was on the floor, my head throbbing a brutal, familiar rhythm. I touched my forehead and my fingers came away stained with crimson. Memory, sharp and vicious, descended upon me. This was the day. The day my husband, Cale, emptied our shared savings to give to Seraphine. I pushed myself up, my body trembling not from weakness, but from a resurgence of white-hot rage. I stumbled into the main room and there he was, just as I remembered. Cale, handsome and cruel, his back to me, stuffing a thick envelope. An envelope that contained the pooled resources of both our families, meant to build our new life, into his jacket pocket. He turned, and his face, which I had once thought was carved from my every dream, was a mask of impatient disdain. No matter what you say today, Alara, I'm taking this to Seraphine. She needs it for her university expenses. His voice was a whetstone against the blade of my hatred. In my first life I had begged. I had pleaded on my knees, asking him to at least leave the food ration coupons. My parents were old. We couldn't keep relying on them. And what had he said? The words echoed in the new, hollowed-out chambers of my soul. Seraphine is an intellectual, not a farm girl like you. She'll achieve greatness and do research that benefits humanity. She just needs a bit of help right now. If you stop me, you're blocking a rising scientist. He had said those words, and then he had stepped over me as I lay bleeding from the gash on my head, slamming the door on our marriage, on my dignity, on our future. This time I did not beg. I stood silent, my hand pressed to my bleeding brow, and watched him. My silence unnerved him. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, flickered with a moment of confusion before hardening once more. "Do you understand me?" he snapped, as if speaking to a stubborn child. I said nothing. I just stared, memorizing the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the utter conviction in his eyes that his path was the only righteous one. He was a man possessed by a delusion, and I had been his foremost enabler. With a final, disgusted grunt, he turned and left. I didn't collapse. I didn't let the tears fall. I walked to the door and watched him go. At the gate, Seraphine was waiting. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Delicate features, large, luminous eyes that always seemed to be on the verge of witnessing a tragedy, especially when it suited her. She wore a simple dress, but she carried herself like a queen, condescending to visit her subjects. Cale carefully handed her the envelope, our future, and I saw her fingers close around it possessively. Her voice, a lilting, coquettish thing, carried on the breeze. "What took you so long? Did your wife say no?" Cale shed his impatience like a cloak and smiled at her, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. It was warm, indulgent. "Of course not. She doesn't get to decide for me. I'm giving you this willingly." Seraphine instantly bristled, a performance I had seen countless times. "What do you mean giving? I'm only borrowing it. Once I succeed, I'll pay you back double. I'm not someone who takes advantage of others for nothing." Yes, you're right," Cale said quickly, his tone placating. "Then let me congratulate you in advance on becoming a great scientist." They stood there, flirting over the ruins of my life, and a sound escaped my lips. A dry, brittle laugh that held no humor. "Never takes advantage. Never accepts unearned favors." How shamelessly she had built such a saintly image for herself, while Cale, her loyal knight, ensured she never had to lift a finger. A memory, sharp and sweetly painful, surfaced. My grandmother, her hands gnarled with arthritis and age, making her special sesame candy and dried sweet potatoes for my birthday. She knew her time was short, and she had worked herself ragged to make piles of it, wanting to leave me with a store of love to last. She told me to share it with Cale, whom she treated as her own grandson. The next day I saw those very treats in Seraphine's hands. She snacked on them casually in the fields, and when she grew bored she tossed the unfinished pieces by the roadside. She treated my grandmother's love, the last physical manifestation of her care, like garbage. I had confronted her then in my first life. Why are these things with you? Weren't they the ones I gave Kale? The public shaming had made her run off in tears. That night, Kale had stormed into our home. Alara, it was just a few lousy dried sweet potatoes. Did you really have to humiliate Seraphine in front of everyone like that? I was the one who gave them to her, so stop picking on her. I'm warning you. Tomorrow you're going to apologize to her in front of everyone, or our engagement is over. And I, terrified of losing him, of being alone, had obeyed. I had apologized for being hurt that my dead grandmother's love had been discarded. The humiliation had been a poison I drank willingly, all for a man who saw me as an obstacle. But that was the old Alara. The one who died in a cold hospital corridor. Now, watching them walk away, their heads close together, I felt the poison solidify into a diamond-hard resolve. I pushed myself from the doorframe, my body moving with a purpose I hadn't possessed in a lifetime. I rushed forward, my feet pounding on the hard-packed earth, and planted myself directly in their path. They stopped, startled. In their wide, astonished eyes, I saw the reflection of my disheveled state. My clothes dirted from the floor, my forehead split and bleeding. Seraphine, I said, my voice firm and clear, cutting through the pastoral quiet. Give me back the money. I stretched my hand out straight toward her. Seraphine's reaction was instantaneous. She shoved the envelope deep into her pocket and clutched it tightly as if I were a common thief. Why should I? She retorted, her voice gaining a shrill edge. Kale gave it to me. Then she turned her pitiful, wide-eyed look on him. Kale, didn't you say you make the decisions in your household? What's your wife doing now? Kale was stunned. This defiance was new. His eyes, filled with a familiar disgust, snapped to me. Alara, what are you making a scene for? As head of this household, don't tell me I can't even touch the money in this house. The words, head of this household, almost made me laugh again. He was the head of a household he was actively looting. You say you're giving her money for some grand reason, I said, my voice cold and steady. Don't twist this with lofty excuses and act like your motives for supporting Seraphine are so noble. If you want to give her your own money, that's up to you. But that envelope doesn't just contain yours. It holds my share too. I worked for that money with my own sweat. What right do you have to take it away? What right do you have to lend it to her? Kale froze. He was so used to my obedience, my adoration, that he had taken it for granted that my money was his to use freely. He had never once considered I might have an opinion. We're husband and wife, he stammered, recovering slightly. What's yours is mine. How can you be so petty, nitpicking with me? I ignored him. I stepped forward, and before Seraphine could react, I reached into her pocket and pulled the envelope out. Her gasp of outrage was a satisfying sound. I didn't run. I stood right there, under Kale's furious gaze, and carefully counted out the portion that belonged to me. Every coin I had saved from selling eggs, from helping neighbors, from the small stipend my grandmother had left me. I tucked my share into the small pouch I wore under my dress, the feel of the coins a solid, comforting weight against my thigh. Then I looked straight at Kale, a sneer twisting my lips. You really are quite the man, aren't you? The irony in my voice was thick enough to choke on. It left them both flustered and speechless. Seraphine, her thin skin burning with humiliation, stomped her foot. I've never been so insulted, she cried and turned and ran. Kale, ever her loyal hound, shot me a look of pure, bewildered hatred before chasing after her. Seraphine. Wait. I didn't watch them go. I turned my back on them and walked into my house, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a fierce, wild joy. It was a small victory, but it was mine. I had drawn a line in the sand. Sitting at the rough-hewn table, I calculated the division of the money again and stored my pouch away, neat and secure. The cut on my forehead throbbed, a persistent reminder of the life I had left behind. I knew this was only the beginning. Kale would be back and he would be angry. The entire village who watched our drama with rapt attention would be talking. But for the first time I didn't care. Their whispers couldn't hurt me anymore. I had already lived through the worst they could offer. I had already died. The rest of the day I planned. I thought of my daughter, her sweet face already beginning to blur at the edges of my memory, a pain I would carry forever. I would not bring her into this world again, into a life of neglect and a father who would sacrifice her for another woman. That love, that sacred duty had been betrayed in the most fundamental way. As the afternoon sun began to wane, I knew what I had to do. It was time to visit my family's home, to stand before the memorial tablets of my father and grandmother. It was time to collect what was rightfully mine, and then I would leave. This house, this marriage, this life. It was all a gilded cage, and I had just snapped the lock. Cale thought he was the head of this household. He was about to find out he was presiding over an empty throne. The walk to my family home was a journey through a ghost landscape of my past. Every rut in the road, every leaning fence post, was a landmark of a memory, most of them painful. This was the path I had trudged down, weary and dusty, following Seraphine to the city in my last life. This was the field where I'd seen her toss my grandmother's sweet potatoes. This was the lane where the village women would fall silent as I passed, their pitying stares feeling like physical blows. My family's cottage stood at the edge of the village, smaller and more dilapidated than I remembered. The thatched roof was thin in places and the vegetable patch was overgrown. After my father's death and my grandmother's passing, there had been no one to maintain it. I had been too busy trying to earn love from a man who had none to give me. I pushed the creaking gate open and stepped into the small, silent yard. The air was still and heavy with neglect. Inside it was dark and smelled of old wood and dust. On the simple wooden altar against the far wall sat two memorial tablets. One for my father, Liam, and one for my grandmother, Anya. Seeing their names carved into the wood was like a punch to the gut. All the resolve I had felt earlier trembled, and for a moment I was just a girl again, alone and terrified. I fell to my knees before them, the hard-packed earth floor cool through my thin trousers. The story of my father and Cale's father, Alistair, was a village legend, one I now knew to be a lie wrapped in a debt. Years ago they had been working in a factory in a distant city. A fire had broken out in the dormitory. In the chaos, my father had shoved Alistair towards safety, sacrificing his own chance to escape. Alistair returned to the village a hero, my father's savior, and eventually became the village head. When my grandmother, in her final illness, had swallowed her pride and called the Alistair to her bedside, she used that life debt to beg them to treat me well. Alistair had promised beautifully, swearing to treat me like his own daughter. His wife, Morwenna, had clutched my hand and vowed to cherish me like the apple of her eye. They were liars. The entire family was built on a foundation of lies and ingratitude. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the silent tablets, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry I was so weak. I forgot who I was. I forgot that I am your daughter." How I wished I could tell my father that the man whose life he saved had become the very one to crush me. If he could live again, I would beg him never to save that ungrateful man in that fire. Then, from a small hidden compartment in the altar that only I knew about, I took out a single stick of incense. I lit it, the fragrant smoke curling upwards in a pale, graceful ribbon. This was for my daughter. The daughter no one had wanted. The daughter whose life had been so carelessly extinguished. I had no body to bury, no tablet to inscribe her name upon, but I carried her in my heart, a permanent aching scar. "I will not bring you into this world again," I vowed, the smoke stinging my eyes. "You deserve peace, not the suffering that was waiting for you here." The pain of holding her as her life slipped away was a physical memory, sharp enough to make me clutch my chest. It was a pain that had killed me once. I would not subject her or myself to it again. Staring at the faces of my father and grandmother in my mind's eye, my resolve hardened into steel. I must leave Cale. This was no longer a desire. It was a biological imperative, like breathing. I would not spend the rest of my life tangled up with these rotten people. If Cale wanted to grovel at Seraphine's feet, he could. But I was done being the pitiful supporting role. Maybe it was because I had already died once, but I felt the strings that had bound me to this place, to this man, simply snap. The blind obsession that had defined my first life was gone, leaving behind a clear, cold clarity. In my past life I had sunk into self-pity, swallowing every grievance. Looking back, all it left me with was a bitterness that clogged my chest. This time I would choose myself. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet. I had one more stop to make, and it would require all the courage I could muster. I left the cottage, the incense stick still burning, a final offering to the ghosts of my past, and headed towards the home of Alistair and Morwenna. Their house was the largest in the village, a symbol of their status. It was solid, built of good stone with a proper tiled roof. I stood outside the gate taking a deep breath, already planning my words. I wasn't here to beg. I was here to collect a debt. I knocked. The door was opened by Morwenna, her face, once handsome, now permanently pinched with dissatisfaction. Seeing me alone, her lips tightened. Elara. Where's Kale? Why didn't he come with you? He went out with Seraphine, I replied evenly. The moment she heard that name, her eyes rolled back in theatrical fury. What? Again with that little fox? Why didn't you stop him? I thought once he married you, you'd be able to keep him in line. Turns out you're useless. In Morwenna's eyes, Seraphine was trouble. Too pretty, too flashy, and too bold. She knew Seraphine would never be content in the countryside, and she hated that the girl was still stringing her son along. But her anger was never directed at Kale, her precious boy. It was always directed at me for not being enough of a lure, for not being a strong enough cage. In my first life I had mistaken her scolding for solidarity. I thought she was on my side. Now I saw the truth. She simply saw me as easy to control, the ideal daughter-in-law because I was malleable and knew my place. I frowned, my patience which had once been infinite, now worn to a nub. Kale's legs are his own. How am I supposed to tie him down? And besides, if scolding worked, you've been at it for years. Did that ever stop him from flirting with Seraphine? Her face froze, her brows knitting together in outrage. You insolent girl. How dare you talk back to your mother-in-law? She raised her hand, the movement practiced and swift, ready to slap me into submission. But I wasn't about to stand there stupidly like in my last life, waiting for the blow to land. I dodged sideways and she, expecting my compliance, stumbled badly, her momentum carrying her forward. She fell onto the ground with a heavy thud, crying out as she twisted her back. Oh, my poor back. Morwenna had always had a bad back, a result of years of taking Kale's place in the fields when he laced around, then coming back to handle all the housework. In the past, I had been the only one patient enough to rub medicinal oil into it, worrying over her pain. Now I only gave her a cold glance. I didn't offer a hand. I stepped over her just as Kale had stepped over me, and walked straight inside to find Alistair, leaving her wailing and cursing behind me. I found him lounging in a rocking chair in the main room, smoking his pipe, relaxed as could be. He had heard the entire argument. There was no way he hadn't, but he hadn't lifted a finger. So long as it didn't touch his own interests, he never bothered to get involved. He was a master of plausible deniability. I smiled, a thin, sharp expression. Dad, I said, getting straight to the point. A few days ago, I happened to run into one of my father's old co-workers from the factory. Alistair's relaxed posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. I continued, my voice sweet and deadly. He told me the compensation money paid out after my father's death was quite a large sum. But when it got to me and my grandmother, it was nowhere near what he described. Isn't that strange? At my words, Alistair shot up from the rocking chair. What are you implying? His voice trembled slightly with a panic he tried to mask with anger. I handed that money to your grandmother with my own 2 hands, he blustered. There were several witnesses back then, so what exactly are you trying to deny now? I looked straight at him, at the guilty flicker in his eyes, and I almost laughed. How foolish my father had been, giving his life for a man like this. Sure, you gave us money, I said evenly. But was it the full amount? Untouched? You yourself admitted there were villagers present at the time. Conveniently, one of my father's old co-workers still lives nearby. Why don't we call everyone together and see whether there was a mistake in what you handed over? My goal was simple, to get back what was rightfully mine and leave. Give me what you owe and I'll keep my mouth shut, I said, my voice dropping. But if you refuse, once the others come, we'll see what happens to your reputation and your position as village chief. Alistair's lips trembled with rage. He never expected me, the girl he thought of as meek and soft, to corner him like this. I could see the calculations going on behind his eyes. His reputation, his power, it was all built on the perception of integrity. A scandal like this, especially with a witness from the factory, could topple him. After a long, tense silence, he turned without a word and went into his bedroom. I heard the sound of a lock clicking open, a chest being moved. He returned, his face ashen, and thrust a thick wad of cash into my hands. It was more than I had expected. The weight of it was a tangible justice. I weighed it in my hand, a faint, cold smile on my lips. I said nothing more. I turned and walked out. As I passed through the doorway, Morwenna was still on the ground, glaring at me with pure venom, muttering curses I didn't bother to catch. Just the sight of her hateful face made my anger flare again, reminding me of how in my last life she had spat that my daughter was just a useless girl born unlucky. Rage, hot and righteous, surged inside me. I stepped forward and, taking advantage of her prone position, gave her a hard kick in the hip. "You're the unlucky one, old hag," I hissed. "One day you'll rot in bed with no one left to care for you." In my last life, that was exactly what had happened. When she became paralyzed in her old age, the husband she'd controlled all her life found his freedom, and Kale was too busy fawning over Seraphine to bother. She was left entirely in my care. I had worked myself to the bone, tending to her, changing her soiled clothes, enduring her curses that I was useless, that I couldn't even hold on to my own husband. This life I swore I would never serve her again. Kicking her left me feeling fresh and unburdened. I walked away with my head high, the money pressed close against my chest, while she, consumed with fury, remained on the ground. I was one step closer to freedom. The strings were cut. Now I just had to fly. The money in my pouch felt like a living thing, a small, hard kernel of my future. I walked away from the Parker house, the late afternoon sun warming my back, and didn't look back. The cut on my forehead throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a dull, persistent reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I needed to tend to it, and then I needed to disappear. The village clinic was a small, whitewashed building on the other side of the settlement. As I walked, the familiar sights seemed both sharp and distant, as if I were viewing them through a pane of glass. This was my world, but I was no longer of it. On the road, the sound of a bicycle bell made me step aside. And then I saw them. Kale, pedaling that shiny new bicycle I had once foolishly believed was a gift for me. On the back, perched side saddle with practiced grace, was Seraphine. Her laughter, light and airy, cut through the air, a sound that had once felt like shards of glass in my heart. Now it barely registered. The sight of that bicycle, however, pulled me back into a memory so vivid it was like a waking dream. It was just before our wedding. Villagers had come to offer congratulations, but some, jealous that I was marrying the village chief's son, couldn't resist their barbs. "You don't have much of a dowry," one woman had sneered. "Your family's poor and shabby. Do you really think the Parkers will value you?" It was true. After my father's death, the pillar of our household was gone, and life for Grandma and me had grown difficult. Our betrothal had survived only because of my father's sacrifice. My face had burned with humiliation, but I had forced myself to reply stubbornly, "The Parkers treat me well. They don't care about those things." "Ha! Who would believe that?" Another had laughed. "If the village chief's son hadn't saved you when you fell in the water, they never would have brought up that engagement again. Just wait. You'll suffer once you marry into that family." The wedding had been simple, done on the cheap. To make it seem like Kale cared, I had worked myself ragged, using the living expenses Grandma gave me to buy a wristwatch and a sewing machine. I told everyone they were gifts from Kale, proof of his love. Then one day I saw the bicycle at the Parker home. My heart had soared. I threw my arms around Kale's waist, tears of joy streaming down my face. "Kale, how did you know?" A bicycle was the only thing missing from the 3 must-haves and 1 want. "I'm so happy." The handsome man in my embrace had stiffened, but he hadn't corrected me. I didn't understand his silence then. It was only later I realized I never once sat on the back of that bike. Seraphine, though, rode it hundreds of times. It had been bought for her all along. One night, I had a terrible stomach ache and begged Kale to take me to the clinic. He had refused, sneering, "Aren't you so tough? It's only a few steps. You can walk. This bike is for Seraphine. I won't let you ride it." I remembered clutching my stomach, walking slowly down the empty village road, my face wet with silent, hopeless tears. Now the scene repeated itself before my eyes. But my heart was a still, cold lake. Kale's eyes flickered as they met mine. With Seraphine's arms still around his waist, he suddenly panicked, braking hard. Seraphine nearly tumbled off. "What are you doing?" she snapped, annoyed as she dismounted. When she saw me, her expression shifted to one of placating concern. "Alara, don't get the wrong idea. Kale was just being kind, giving me a ride to buy something. Nothing improper happened between us. Please don't spread rumors that would ruin my reputation." I smiled, a faint, dismissive curl of my lips. I brushed past her without a glance and kept walking towards the clinic. Her frantic explanation only made her look ridiculous. Explain to whom? I wasn't even legally married to Kale. If they shared a bed I wouldn't care. My indifference unsettled her. Kale, look at her, she complained, her voice taking on a whining tone. Isn't she being terribly rude? For once Kale didn't echo her. He only stood there frowning, staring after me as I walked away. I could feel his gaze on my back, a weight I was no longer willing to carry. In the past, my jealousy and pain had been a perverse validation for him. My calm disinterest was a language he didn't understand, and it clearly unnerved him. The nurse at the clinic cleaned and bandaged the cut on my forehead, her touch gentle and impersonal. You should be more careful, Ilara, she murmured, a hint of pity in her eyes. The village gossip mill was clearly already turning. I just nodded, paid with a few coins from my pouch, and left. Back at the house Kale and I shared, I worked quickly and quietly. I packed a small bundle of my simplest, sturdiest clothes, my few personal treasures, the photographs of my father and grandmother, the small carving my father had made for me as a child. I hid the bundle under a loose floorboard near the bed. It wouldn't do for Kale to find it if he decided to come back. Before leaving the Parker house that afternoon, I had used the same tactic of veiled threats to force Alistair into arranging a letter of introduction for me. I needed it if I wanted to travel and find work in another town. He had been reluctant, of course. My departure would make his son look like a man abandoned by his wife. The gossip would be fierce. But I had argued, my voice cold and logical. Kale doesn't love me and he refuses to have children with me. How will your family carry on its line then? Seraphine is from the city. He got into college. If not for my engagement to Kale, he would have chased after her long ago. Don't you want a daughter-in-law who's both beautiful and educated? Unlike Morwenna, Alistair cared more for appearances and social climbing than anything else. The idea of a college-educated daughter-in-law appealed to his vanity. Who would cling to something worse and let go of something better? That was how Alistair thought. In the end he had relented. If I wanted to leave, then I could leave. He could always spin the story to his advantage later. So much had happened on this first day of my rebirth that I was drained, both physically and emotionally. As dusk fell, I collapsed onto the bed, falling into a hazy, exhausted sleep. I was jolted awake not long after by the loud, angry sound of the door being shoved open. Kale stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, his frame tense with fury. We rarely shared the same bed, so I only frowned, turned over, and tried to reclaim the shreds of my sleep. I didn't get up to greet him. I didn't slip into the kitchen to cook him noodles to warm his stomach as I had done countless times before. After a while, I sensed a shadow fall over me. Alert, I opened my eyes to see him standing by the bed, staring down at me. His expression was a turbulent mix of anger, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. I met his gaze in silence, my own face a mask of cool indifference. My calm seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst could have. Finally he spoke, his voice tight. Today, when you suddenly appeared on the road, you scared Seraphine. She fell off the bike and twisted her ankle. Tomorrow, you need to go apologize to her. A laugh, dry and humorless, escaped me. I sat up on the bed, the blanket pooling around my waist. Why? I asked, my voice clear and sharp in the dark room. Why should I apologize to her? You were the one riding the bike. She got hurt because of you. Yet somehow you pushed the blame onto me. Kel, you're shameless. Do you really take me for a fool you can shove around at will? Is this your way of flirting with her by making me go bow and scrape? Kale glared at me, anger flaring in his sharp features. He wasn't used to this defiance. Seraphine isn't like you, he snapped, his voice rising. She's frail. She's not rough and thick-skinned. What might seem like a small injury to you is a serious pain for her. Don't you bear some responsibility for today? I'm telling you to apologize for your own good, for your reputation. I laughed again, the sound bitter. Oh right. He's delicate. I'm coarse. You want your wife to go grovel and apologize to another woman? Does that make you feel proud? Do you even know what the villagers say about you too? Do you know how they laugh at me? Reputation? The three of us lost that long ago. I only just realized that if you can't respect yourself, no one else ever will. In my last life I had listened to him. Time and again I had bowed my head and apologized to Seraphine. And what had I gotten in return? His indifference, his contempt, the villagers' ridicule. I didn't need that. Not anymore. Kale's face darkened with fury. Alara, what's gotten into you today? Your words are vile. Seraphine and I share nothing but a revolutionary friendship. I've never had improper thoughts about her. Don't slander her and ruin her reputation. I stood up, stepping closer to him until we were almost nose to nose. I fixed him with a mocking stare. Improper thoughts? Don't you know better than anyone whether you've had them? Do you think the whole village is blind? Do you think they haven't seen you trailing after Seraphine like a dog? Showering her with gifts, treating her with tenderness while leaving your new wife in the cold? Kale, because of you I've become a complete laughingstock. If you have even a shred of conscience left, stop trampling on my dignity. I took a deep breath, the memories of my daughter's still face giving me a courage born of utter despair. You care about Seraphine. I care about myself. Force me one more time to apologize to her, and I'll hang myself with a rope right in the village square. I'll leave a letter and make sure it's read aloud at the broadcast station, telling everyone exactly how you and Seraphine carried on in secret, how you disgraced yourselves. Let's see if Seraphine still manages to graduate. Let's see how you manage to hold your head up then. Fueled by the bitterness of my past life, my words were heavy and cruel. My eyes burned with a hatred so pure it made Kale stumble back 2 steps. His face twisted with confusion, disbelief, and even a trace of fear. He couldn't understand how I had come to hate him this much, how I could even speak of suicide. To him I had always been the girl whose whole heart and eyes were filled with him. He must have thought it was jealousy that had broken me. That was the excuse he would settle on, a neat reason for my transformation. He drew in 2 sharp breaths, didn't argue further, and only muttered, "You're simply unreasonable," before storming out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. When his panicked footsteps faded, I slumped back onto the bed. Hang myself for a man as rotten as him? Impossible. I had only said it so he would understand I was no longer his to command. Since he cared so much about Seraphine's reputation, maybe he'd actually fear that if he pushed me too far I'd ruin it. At least for now he wouldn't dare harass me again. In the empty house, the full weight of the day's events finally crashed down on me. I reached under the pillow and pulled out the old photographs. My tears, hot and silent, soaked through the paper. After Grandma and Dad died, no one had ever cherished me again. If that was the case, then I had to love myself twice as much. I swore I would never let anyone bully me again. If heaven truly had spirits, then surely it was Grandma and Dad who had pleaded for me to be reborn. I had to live well. I had to live strong. What was this hardship compared to losing my child? I no longer loved Kale. His so-called affection was the cheapest, most disgusting thing in this world. And I was finally free of it. From that day on, Kale never came home. I didn't know where he stayed and I didn't care to ask. The silence in the house was a balm. For the first time in years, the space felt like my own. I used the days to finalize my plans, to gather my strength. I bought a train ticket to a southern province I had only ever heard of in stories. A place of opportunity, far from the stifling familiarity of this village. The day of my departure dawned clear and fine. The weather felt like a blessing. I dressed in my plainest clothes, shouldered my small bundle of belongings, and took one last look around the house that had been my prison. There was no nostalgia, only a profound sense of closure. I left the key on the table and walked out, closing the door softly behind me. I did not look back. On the road to the station, I ran into a small group of educated youths who were also returning to the city. When they saw me carrying luggage, their expressions showed surprise, but they were tactful enough not to ask questions. Everyone in the village knew how Kale treated me. These young people, unlike Seraphine, still understood right from wrong. In their eyes, her behavior was a disgrace to their identity. One of them, a girl with kind eyes named Lien, slipped me some fruit and dry rations. "For the journey," she said softly. "I never got to thank you properly. That time I was late finishing my field work, you stepped in and helped me without asking for any pay. I didn't even remember the incident. In my past life, I had been so wrapped up in my own misery that such small acts of kindness were a blur. But I thanked her and accepted her kindness, the simple gesture warming a place in my heart I thought had frozen solid. The train station was a chaos of noise and steam and humanity. I clutched my ticket and letter of introduction tightly, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. The point of no return. As the train roared into the station, its sound was deafening, a beast of progress and change. I found a seat by a grimy window and stared out as the village, my entire world, began to slide away. The fields, the houses, the people, they shrank into insignificance, becoming nothing more than a smudge on the landscape. As the train picked up speed, a strange sensation filled my chest. It was tight and aching, and for a moment I thought it was fear. But then I recognized it. It was regret. Not for leaving Cale, but for ever loving him. Regret for the years I had wasted, for the self I had neglected, for the vast world I had let myself believe was too big for me. I had lived so small in a cage of my own making. Tears stung my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. I breathed in the sooty metallic air of the train car, and it tasted like freedom. Meanwhile, Cale had not gone back to his own home, but had instead stayed at his so-called best friend's house. Those days his mind was in chaos. He even dreamt a wild, absurd dream so vivid it felt like a memory. In it, he was madly in love with Seraphine, following her from the countryside to the city, working himself to the bone to earn her living expenses. During that time I had given birth to a sweet but sickly daughter. Yet he never fulfilled the role of a father. For 10 years straight he devoted himself to Seraphine, hollowing out his family's savings, taking reckless risks to make money for her dreams, even stealing the life-saving money for our daughter's surgery to cover the debts of her failed research. And in his dream, with his help, Seraphine truly did become a brilliant scientist. When Cale thought he could finally be with her, she looked at him with utter disdain and said, "Be with you? Do you even deserve me? I am a highly educated scientist and you're just a country bumpkin. All these years of money you gave me, I'll have my assistant transfer it back to you. Once you've received it, don't ever contact me again." Then she lifted her hand, flashing a diamond ring, and told him she was soon to be engaged to the CEO of a listed company. Cale stood there dumbfounded, utterly stunned. It was only then he realized he had been played by Seraphine his entire life. Furious, he tried to confront her, but her bodyguards pinned him to the ground, beating him mercilessly until he was beaten to death. In those final seconds, he remembered that rainy night when I had begged him to leave the money for our daughter's treatment. Was I holding our child just as desperate as he felt now? He jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat. Thankfully it had only been a dream. He admitted to himself that he did like Seraphine, but not so far gone that he would sacrifice his own daughter's life. The thought of a child, soft and sweet, calling him daddy, stirred something unfamiliar in his chest. A tremor of remorse? He suddenly remembered the way I had screamed at him that day, hysterical and broken. Had he really treated me too harshly all these years? Glancing at a calendar on the wall, he realized with a start that it was my birthday. His expression shifted, touched by a strange, unfamiliar guilt. At once he grabbed some money, planning to head to town and buy me gifts. My favorite pastries, some candies, a new dress. He imagined bringing them home openly so the whole village could see. He wanted them to know he did care for me, that I truly was his wife. But as he stepped outside, it was Seraphine he found waiting for him. She bounced toward him playfully. "Cale, can you take me to the department store? I need to look for some new books." He hesitated, then said a little apologetically, "Seraphine, today is Alara's birthday. I need to be with her." Seraphine blinked, then burst out laughing as if she'd heard the funniest joke. "Are you kidding me? Alara packed her bags today. She's gone. She said she's not coming back." Cale's brow furrowed. "What nonsense is that? How could she? We're married. Where could she go?" A villager passing by couldn't hold back and added, "It's true, Cale. I saw her at the station early this morning, but I didn't dare stop her. Honestly, I thought you two were divorced already." "We're not divorced," Cale blurted, panic seizing him. But then the realization hit him like a physical blow. They had never even registered their marriage. All they had done was hold a simple ceremony. He had resisted the official paperwork, and now it meant nothing. There was no legal tie to bind me to him. His face turned ashen. He jumped on his bicycle and peeled out of the village like the wind, pedaling furiously towards the station. Sweat poured down his face by the time he arrived, his once handsome appearance now ragged and desperate. He searched frantically among the crowds, pushing people aside, calling my name. "Alara. Alara, where are you?" But I was long gone. The train I was on was already hundreds of miles away, carrying me toward a new dawn. He searched for hours until his voice was hoarse and his legs gave way. He collapsed on the grimy station floor, his eyes dull and lifeless. I had truly left him. How could I bear to? He buried his face in his hands and sobbed, the sound ugly and raw, feeling something inside him collapse into a vast empty silence. The dream had been a warning and he had ignored it. Now the consequences were real and they were absolute. The city was a roaring beast of sound and motion. After the suffocating silence of the village, the cacophony of honking cars, shouting vendors, and the sheer press of humanity was both terrifying and exhilarating. I clutched my small bundle to my chest, the money sewn into the lining of my coat feeling like a fragile talisman against the overwhelming unknown. I had an address scrawled on a piece of paper by Lien, the kind, educated youth. It was for a women's dormitory, a cheap, crowded place where out-of-town workers could find a bed. The room was shared with 7 other women, the air thick with the smells of sweat, cheap perfume and cooking oil. It was a far cry from the spacious, if loveless, home I had shared with Kale, but it was mine. For the first time the space around me was not borrowed, not conditional on someone else's approval. It was a profound, dizzying feeling. My first priority was work. I had no formal education, no city skills. But I had 2 things: a fierce determination and hands that were no stranger to hard labor. I found work in a textile factory on the outskirts of the city. The hours were long, the work monotonous, the foreman's voice a constant, critical drone. My fingers grew raw and calloused from handling the rough fabric and the lint in the air coated my lungs. But at the end of each week I was paid. The coins and small bills I received were not filtered through Kale's condescending hands. They were mine, earned by the sweat of my brow. It was at the factory that I reconnected with Jenny. In my past life she had been a vague acquaintance, another village girl who had left for the city. Here she was a lifeline. We recognized the same rural resilience in each other, the same guarded hope. She worked at a neighboring food processing plant, and we often walked back to the dormitory together, sharing our small triumphs and frustrations. "Elara, you're too quiet," she said to me one evening, her arm linked through mine. "You work like a demon but your eyes are always so far away. What are you running from?" I looked at her open, honest face and felt a dangerous urge to confide. But the wounds were too fresh, the story too monstrous. "A bad marriage," I said simply, the understatement of a lifetime. She squeezed my arm. "Aren't they all? My father wanted to trade me for a new plow. That's why I'm here." She laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "We make our own way now." It was Jenny who first proposed the idea of the street stall. The factory wages were a pittance, barely enough for food and rent. "We need to be our own bosses," she declared, her eyes gleaming with entrepreneurial fire. "I see the women selling hair ribbons and socks near the night market. The markup is crazy. We can do that. We can do it better." And so we began. We pooled our meager savings and bought a small rickety cart. We sourced cheap but pretty hair accessories, socks and small trinkets from a wholesaler in a labyrinthine market. Our business was born. The life of a street vendor was a different kind of grueling. We worked our factory shifts by day and by night we became merchants. We had to be sharp, haggling with customers, always keeping one eye out for the police. Unlicensed vending was illegal and the consequences of being caught were severe. Fines we couldn't pay, confiscation of our entire stock. More than once we had to run. The cry of "Ching Guan" would go up and chaos would erupt. We'd grab the corners of the sheet that held our goods, forming a makeshift sack, and flee into the dark, narrow alleys, our hearts pounding in our throats, the sound of heavy boots echoing behind us. We were 2 women, stumbling through the darkness with the weight of our fragile dreams clutched in our hands. One night, after a particularly close call, we collapsed against a damp brick wall, gasping for air. Our stock was safe, but my knee was scraped raw from a fall and Jenny had lost a shoe. "This is madness," I panted, the taste of fear still metallic in my mouth. Jenny, her hair escaping its braid, grinned wildly. "But we got away. And look." He opened the sack. In the dim light, we counted our earnings from the short time we'd been open. It was more than a full day's wage at the factory. Sitting there in that filthy alley, counting those grubby bills by the light of a single sputtering street lamp, we couldn't help but smile. Our faces, smudged with dirt and exhaustion, glowed with a shared, defiant joy. I knew I was an ordinary woman, small in this vast, indifferent city, but I was fighting for my life. And I was winning. I didn't need a man to survive. In fact, only by leaving Kale had I gained a new life. The world was wide and I was finally seeing it. This was the road I hadn't chosen in my last life, but this time I was determined to walk it through to the end. Years bled into one another, marked not by seasons but by the slow, steady accumulation of savings. Jenny and I graduated from the rickety cart to a small fixed stall in a slightly better market. We no longer had to run from the police. We paid our fees, we knew the beat cops, and we became a fixture. Our reputation for fair prices and good quality grew. We finally saved enough to take the ultimate risk. We rented a tiny shop. It was no bigger than the main room of my old village house, but it had a solid door we could lock and a roof that didn't leak. Luna's Treasures, we called it after the Roman moon goddess Jenny had read about in a tattered book. For women by women, she'd say with a wink. The day we opened, we stood outside looking at our names painted on the window. A feeling of accomplishment so profound it was almost a physical ache settled in my chest. I had built this. We had built this. It was Jenny who first noticed him. "Ilara," she said one afternoon, her voice low with concern. "There's a man. He's been standing across the street for 3 days now, just watching the shop. Should we call the police?" A cold dread, one I hadn't felt in years, trickled down my spine. I turned slowly. It was Kale. But it was a Kale I barely recognized. His clothes were shabby and hung loosely on his frame, which was gaunt and stooped. The proud, straight back of the village chief's son was gone, replaced by a defeated slump. His face was sallow, etched with deep lines of hardship, and his eyes, once so bright with arrogant fire, were dull and hollow. He looked like a man the wind could blow over. When he noticed me watching, he managed a bitter, twisted smile that didn't reach his eyes. He crossed the street, his movements slow as if every step cost him effort. "Ilara," he said, his voice raspy. "Seeing me like this must make you feel satisfied, doesn't it?" In that moment, under the gaze of those broken eyes, the last of my hatred didn't flare. It simply evaporated, leaving behind a vast, empty pity. He was no longer the villain of my story, just a pathetic footnote. "What do you want, Kale?" My voice was calm, flat. He looked down at his worn-out shoes. "That day after you left the station, I was riding back to the village. I wasn't paying attention. I tripped, hit my head on a stone." He touched his temple absently. "And then, I remembered. Everything. The dream wasn't a dream, was it? It was real. I really did let our daughter die." He looked up at me then, and the raw, unvarnished agony in his gaze was a truth I couldn't deny. He remembered. He knew the full weight of his sins. "We grew up together," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "You loved me for 10 years without regret. And this bastard, I threw you away. I know it's impossible to repay. I know there can never be another chance." He told me he had learned which city I was in, but shame had kept him away. He'd drifted, jobless and aimless, a ghost of his former self. And Seraphine? The moment she saw he was no longer useful, that he had no more money to give, she had dropped him and clung to another man with better prospects. Then he told me of the Parker family's downfall. An anonymous letter, packed with evidence, had arrived with the county officials. It detailed how Alistair had skimmed my father's death compensation, his extortion of the villagers, his embezzlement of village funds, even his affairs with several widows. He was arrested, his reputation in tatters. The family was ruined, despised by everyone. Morwenna, unable to bear the shame and the sudden poverty, had suffered a stroke and was left paralyzed. "At first I tried to care for her," Kale said, his voice hollow. "But her tongue, it was so harsh. Always cursing, always blaming me. And the poverty, it was crushing." He looked away, his shame complete. "I left her. I spent my last money on a train ticket to come here. I needed to see that you were okay. I thought if I knew you were living well, it might ease the torment." I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, let him stand there in the wreckage of the life he had chosen. Finally I spoke. "Yes, you're pitiful now. But for me it's still not enough." I smiled, a faint, cold thing. "Unfortunately, you have nothing left to lose, so you're not even worth hating anymore." I saw the truth of my words hit him, a final, killing blow. "Of course," I added, my voice dropping, "the anonymous letter was mine." His head snapped up, shock warring with the dawning understanding that the woman he had thought was meek and soft had been the architect of his family's destruction. How could I let a man like your father go unpunished? I asked. My father gave his life for him and he repaid us with betrayal. He stole my father's compensation and your mother helped grind me into the dirt. I even expected she would suffer a stroke from the shock. Perhaps heaven itself lent me its hand in punishing evil. I looked at him, this hollowed-out man who had once held my heart and my life in his careless hands. As for you, being discarded by Seraphine broke you beyond repair. No matter how you struggle now, you will never rise again. I had no more words. I had no more anger. I turned to go back into my shop, the place I had built from nothing. Suddenly I heard a thud behind me. I turned to see Cale on his knees on the dirty pavement, his face contorted, tears streaming down his cheeks. Elara, I regret everything, he choked out. I was blinded, lost with Seraphine. But in my heart you were always the special one. Otherwise I would never have married you. Please forgive me. Let me spend the rest of my life atoning. I swear I will love you with my whole life. He clutched at the hem of my dress, groveling in the dust. The reversal was so complete it was almost biblical. Once I had been the one so lowly before him. I looked up at the hazy city sky, my gaze indifferent. So what if I was in your heart? You still chased after Seraphine. You wanted both but ended up with nothing from her. And now you come running back to me like some withered patch of grass. Cale, do you really think I'm that easy to fool? He staggered to his feet, panicked. No, that's not it. Before you left, I truly wanted to be good to you. On your birthday, I even bought you several dresses, but I never got the chance to give them to you. He fumbled in his grimy bag and pulled out several packages, wrapped in paper that was now yellowed and stained. The dresses inside were still neatly folded, untouched by time. He handed them to me, his eyes full of a desperate, pathetic hope. I took them. I felt the cheap fabric under my fingers. And then, without a moment's hesitation, I threw them on the ground and stomped on them again and again, grinding the faded prints into the grime of the street. I don't want them, I said, my voice cold and final. Get out. I never want to see you again, you murderer. The word hung in the air between us. Murderer. My daughter would always be the pain I could never heal. If killing weren't against the law, I would have already cut him into 1,000 pieces. He stared at the soiled, trampled dresses under my feet, the last glimmer of hope in his eyes snuffing out into nothingness. All right, he whispered, his voice a broken echo. I'll go. I'll go. He turned and shuffled away, a solitary, broken figure being swallowed by the city's crowds. I watched him until he disappeared around a corner. Then I turned my back, walked into my shop and closed the door on the past. The encounter with Cale left a strange, quiet hollow in its wake. The ghost that had haunted the edges of my new life had finally appeared, only to prove he was just a man. A broken, pathetic one at that. The fury that had fueled me for years had burned out, leaving behind the cool, clean ashes of indifference. I had looked my monster in the eye and found him frail. Life at Luna's Treasures continued, richer for his absence. Jenny and I poured our energy into the shop and our small business began to thrive. We started designing our own simple clothing patterns, hiring a few seamstresses, and slowly we evolved from a retail shop into a small budding brand. The Luna label began to stand for something: resilience, quality, and a quiet kind of beauty. Our success allowed us to think bigger. We scouted locations and decided to open a small factory, a place that could provide stable jobs for other women who had come to the city with nothing but determination. The decision felt right, a way to transmute the pain of my past into something that could nurture the future of others. When considering locations, my hometown province, with its lower costs and available workforce, was a logical choice. I felt no sentimental pull, only a cool, practical assessment. The past held no power over me anymore. It was just a place on a map. The news of my factory's expansion spread through the old village grapevine faster than any official announcement. On the first day we began hiring, a line of applicants stretched around the block. Among them were faces I recognized, women who had once pitied me or worse mocked me. Now they looked at me with a new, complex mixture of awe, respect, and shame. One woman, a former neighbor named Fun, clasped my hand with her work-roughened ones, her eyes glistening. "Alaire, look at you. We always knew you were meant for more than that, Cale." Her words were kind, but the subtext was clear. They were revising history, aligning themselves with my success. That old Parker woman got what she deserved, didn't she? Swaggering around, cursing everyone. Now her husband's in prison. She was paralyzed, and that son of hers, he didn't take care of her. She didn't last more than a few months. The stench was so bad no one would even rent rooms in their building. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a gossipy whisper. As for Cale, no one knows where he's gone. Probably dead in a ditch somewhere. I listened, my face a polite mask. The news of Morwenna's fate was an expected echo. The universe had simply collected on a debt. As for Cale, her words conjured no feeling in me. He was already a ghost. But the ghost wasn't finished yet. Not long after the factory opened, I saw him again. He was waiting by the gate at the end of the day, more haggard than before, his body seeming to float inside his ragged clothes. His skin had a sickly yellow tint, and he was so thin he looked like a strong wind could blow him down. He was the walking embodiment of ruin. Our eyes met across the dusty yard. He opened his mouth, a desperate, wordless plea etched onto his gaunt face. But when his gaze met my cold, distant one, the words died before they were born. He saw no softness there, no crack in the foundation of my resolve, not even the heat of hatred to warm himself against. He saw only a final, absolute closure. He flinched as if struck, lowered his head and shuffled away into the twilight without a sound. That was the last time I ever saw him. Later word reached me through the factory grapevine. Cale had been sick, a terminal illness that had eaten him away from the inside. He had no money for treatment, no one to care for him. He had held on for a while, a stubborn, fading ember, and then he had simply gone out. When the news of Cale's death finally reached me, I was in my office, reviewing production schedules. I put down my pen and looked out the window at the bustling factory floor below. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a tightness in my throat. For a terrifying second I thought I might cry for him. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a deep, shuddering sigh escaped me, a final exhalation of a poison I had been carrying for 2 lifetimes. The pressure wasn't grief. It was the last vestige of the pain leaving my body for good. Not for him, not to mourn him, but because I felt with a certainty that shook my soul, that my loved ones in heaven, my father, my grandmother, my daughter, had finally seen the last person who had truly wronged me receive his judgment. The scales were balanced. The account was closed. Boss Alara? What are you daydreaming about? We've got another big order. Jenny's cheerful voice called from the doorway, pulling me back into the vibrant, noisy present. I turned from the window. The women at the sewing machines were looking my way, waiting for their next instructions, their faces alive with purpose. The evening sky beyond the windows was painted in dazzling shades of orange and purple, the wind carrying away the last remnants of my old pain on its breath. I had no more time to dwell on the past. Smiling, I answered her, my voice clear and strong. Coming. The story of Cale and me ended there. But my life, my real life, kept moving forward. The years that followed were not marked by drama or ghosts, but by the quiet, satisfying rhythm of growth. Luna's Treasures became a respected name, known for its ethical practices and its commitment to employing women in need. We opened 2 more small factories in neighboring provinces. I taught myself to read ledgers, to negotiate contracts, to lead with a quiet firmness that I had never known I possessed. The frightened, love-starved farm girl was a faded photograph in a drawer somewhere. The woman I was now was forged in fire and tempered by self-reliance. One afternoon, dressed in a tailored suit of our own design, I stood with Jenny at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for our new flagship store in the provincial capital. The air was filled with the pop of camera flashes and the murmur of well-dressed attendees. We had made it. We were no longer street vendors fleeing down dark alleys. We were business owners, employers, success stories. And then across the crowd I saw her. Seraphine. She was working the event not as a guest but as a waitress, circulating with a tray of champagne flutes. Time had not been kind to her delicate beauty. There was a hardness around her eyes, a downturn set to her mouth that spoke of disappointment and bitterness. Her dress was cheap, her posture deflated. The rising scientist had never risen. Our eyes met. In hers, I saw a flash of stunned recognition, followed by a wave of profound embarrassment and a furious, unwilling resentment. But I was no longer the poor farm girl she could look down upon. I had risen on my own terms, while she had fallen from the pedestal others had built for her. The contrast was so stark it was almost cruel. She had no witty remark, no coquettish defense. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Holding my gaze for a second too long, her face flushed a deep, mortified red. She turned abruptly, nearly dropping her tray, and slipped through the crowd, disappearing out a service entrance. I didn't look after her. I disliked her, yes, but the one I had truly hated was Kale, and that hatred was now ashes. She was just a reminder of a story that was over. I continued to build my life, a life that was full and peaceful. I never remarried. I had lovers, some kind, some interesting, but I never again gave anyone the keys to my soul. My heart was my own, and that was enough. My family was the one I had built. Jenny, my loyal partner and fierce friend. The women who worked for me and called me Boss Elara with genuine affection. The memory of my father and grandmother, which I now honored by living well, not by mourning. One evening many years later, I stood on the balcony of my comfortable apartment, looking out at the city lights glittering like a field of fallen stars. The wind was warm, carrying the distant hum of traffic. I thought about the long, twisted road that had brought me here. The desperate love, the searing betrayal, the cold despair of loss, the fierce struggle of rebirth. I had loved and lost. I had been broken and remade myself, piece by piece. I had sought revenge and found it, not in violence, but in a success so complete it rendered my tormentors irrelevant. I had carried the ghost of my daughter in my heart until the weight of her memory became a source of strength, not just sorrow. The world was vast, and I had carved out my own small corner of it. I had learned that freedom wasn't just about leaving a place or a person, it was about reclaiming the narrative of your own life. My story was no longer a tragic subplot in someone else's novel. It was mine alone. The evening sky was a deep, boundless blue, the last light of day a fading ribbon on the horizon. The wind whispered through the streets below, carrying away the final lingering remnants of old pain. I took a deep, clean breath of the city air. I had no more battles to fight, no more ghosts to lay to rest. I turned my back on the view and walked inside, closing the glass door on the past. The story of Kale and Elara was finished. But Elara's story, my story, was still being written, and for the first time, every word was my own. The end.